Assyria knew how to destroy a city. It could cut down orchards, build siege ramps, batter walls, deport families, and carve the victory into palace stone. In Judah, Assyria did exactly that. Lachish fell. Fortified towns fell. Hezekiah paid tribute. But Jerusalem, the city everyone expected to break next, did not become another Assyrian conquest scene. The story begins with an empire that had turned fear into a system. By the late 8th century BC, Assyria was the dominant military power of the Near East. Its kings did not simply win wars. They built a language of terror around victory. Cities that rebelled could be surrounded, starved, breached, stripped of people, and folded into the empire as examples. Judah was a small hill kingdom caught inside that world. It was not a match for Assyria in numbers, wealth, or reach. Jerusalem was important to Judah, but to Assyria it was one stubborn capital among many. The empire had crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts. It had taken older cities and richer cities. That is what makes the Jerusalem story work. It is not a tale of equal armies. It is a story about a smaller city standing at the edge of an imperial machine. The question is not whether Assyria was powerful, the question is why this particular campaign left behind a strange ending, devastation everywhere around Jerusalem, tribute from its king, but no Assyrian boast that the city itself had been captured. The ending is especially strange because Assyria usually wanted clarity. Its kings wrote as if the gods had placed the world in their hands. When enemies submitted, the texts said so. When walls were breached, the texts said so. When loot and prisoners were taken, the texts said so. Jerusalem's story survives because the expected final sentence is missing. To understand Jerusalem's survival, we first have to look away from Jerusalem. We have to look at Lachish. Lachish was one of Judah's major fortified cities, guarding routes through the lowlands. When Sennacherib came west in 701 BC, Lachish became the kind of victory Assyria wanted the world to remember. The palace reliefs from Nineveh show the siege in brutal detail. Assyrian soldiers move in formation. Siege engines roll toward the walls. Defenders fight from above. Prisoners are led away. Families leave with bundles. The king sits on a throne while the captured city is processed into imperial memory. That scene matters because it shows what Assyria normally celebrated. When a city fell, Assyria had no reason to be shy. It named the place. It displayed the assault. It made the humiliation visible. Lachish became a monument to what resistance could cost. So when we later ask why Jerusalem has no equivalent Assyrian conquest image, we are not arguing from silence alone. We are comparing Jerusalem to a nearby city whose fall Assyria proudly turned into art. That comparison keeps the episode grounded. We are not imagining what Assyria might have done in theory. We can see what it did in practice. Lachish gives us the empire's preferred grammar of victory. Ramp, breach, throne, captives, display. Jerusalem's survival is measured against that grammar. Hezekiah ruled Judah in a dangerous generation. Assyrian power had already reshaped the region. The northern kingdom of Israel had fallen earlier. Smaller states survived by paying tribute, choosing allies carefully, and hoping the empire had more urgent problems elsewhere. But empires create temptations. When a strong king dies, when rebellions spread, when Egypt promises help, vassal states can start to imagine a different future. Hezekiah appears in this world as a ruler who pushed back against Assyrian control. Biblical texts remember him as a reforming king. Assyrian sources remember him as a ruler who did not remain obedient. That choice made Jerusalem a target. From the Assyrian point of view, rebellion could not be allowed to look profitable. If Judah could withhold tribute and survive without punishment, others might try the same thing. Sennacherib's campaign was therefore not only about one small kingdom, it was about restoring the empire's reputation after defiance. Hezekiah's choice was not a simple heroic gesture. It was a gamble made under the shadow of a superpower. And once the gamble was made, ordinary people would have carried the risk. Royal policy becomes village fear very quickly. Farmers, guards, priests, scribes, and families in smaller towns would have been the first to feel the empire's answer. The decision made in Jerusalem did not stay inside the palace. Jerusalem's defense was not only a matter of walls and soldiers, it was a matter of water. A city under siege dies quickly if its water can be cut off. The spring outside the vulnerable part of the city became a strategic problem, useful in peace, dangerous in war. The biblical account says Hezekiah stopped up water sources outside the city and directed water inward. The tunnel associated with this preparation runs through bedrock, carrying water from the Gihon spring toward the pool of Siloam. The Siloam inscription found in the tunnel preserves the memory of workers cutting from opposite ends until they met inside the rock. Whether every detail lines up exactly with the Assyrian crisis is debated, but the defensive logic is clear. Jerusalem was not waiting passively for a miracle. It was preparing like a city that expected a siege. Water had to be hidden from attackers and protected from people inside the walls. The tunnel gives the story a physical layer. Survival was not only prayer, politics, or chance, it was engineering under pressure. That is why water should not be treated as a side detail. In a siege, water is time. More water means more days before surrender becomes unavoidable. More days mean more room for negotiation, disease in the enemy camp, changing orders, or a strategic withdrawal. A tunnel does not have to win a war by itself to change the choices available to a besieged city. Sennacherib's campaign moved through the western territories with the momentum of a state that had done this many times before. Assyrian royal inscriptions present the king as unstoppable. He restores order, punishes rebels, receives tribute, and arranges the world around his authority. Judah was caught in this sweep. The Assyrian record says Sennacherib captured many fortified towns belonging to Hezekiah. The exact number belongs to the language of royal inscription, but the point is not subtle. Judah was badly hit. This was not a symbolic raid. It was a full military disaster for the countryside. The campaign would have shattered farms, local defenses, storage systems, and confidence. Refugees may have moved toward Jerusalem. News of fallen towns would have reached the capital before the main pressure arrived. The city was not facing Assyria in isolation. It was watching the kingdom around it collapse. That is why the survival of Jerusalem cannot be framed as if Judah simply won. Judah suffered heavily. The capital survived after the rest of the landscape paid a terrible price. The campaign also reminds us that ancient kingdoms were networks, not only capitals. A king could remain on his throne while his kingdom was weakened. Roads could be unsafe, storage centers destroyed, border towns emptied, and tribute obligations increased. Jerusalem's survival did not erase the damage. It preserved a political and religious center inside a wounded state. Lachish became the campaign's visual trophy. Its fall was important enough to decorate Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. In those reliefs, Assyria turns a battlefield into a permanent message. The city is shown on a slope. The siege ramp climbs toward the wall. Attackers and defenders crowd the scene. The king receives the defeated. These reliefs are not neutral journalism. They are imperial art. They show what Assyria wanted viewers to understand. Rebellion ends under the king's gaze, yet propaganda can still preserve historical information. The reliefs tell us that Lachish mattered. They show Assyrian siege technology. They show deportation and surrender. They show the emotional architecture of conquest. For this video, Lachish is the contrast. It gives us the image of a Judahite city that Assyria could say it had taken. The reliefs do not make Jerusalem less important, they make Jerusalem more interesting. If Sennacherib had taken Jerusalem in the same way, why does the campaign's surviving Assyrian memory not look like Lachish? The reliefs also show that conquest was more than military success. It was communication. A palace visitor did not need to know Judah personally to understand the message. The king had punished rebellion. The empire had reached far away. The defeated had been moved from their own city into the king's story. The most famous Assyrian witness is the prism associated with Sennacherib's annals, often called the Taylor Prism. It is a clay object covered in cuneiform, a royal text that presents the king's campaigns in the voice of Assyrian power. In that account, Hezekiah is not portrayed as a victorious rebel. He is trapped. The text says Sennacherib shut him up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. It lists tribute, silver, gold, valuable goods, and members of the royal household sent to Assyria. It presents Hezekiah as humbled and forced back into submission. But notice the shape of the boast. Sennacherib says he confined Hezekiah. He says he took towns. He says tribute came. He does not say he captured Jerusalem for an Assyrian king. That distinction matters. Royal inscriptions could exaggerate, stylize, and reshape events, but they were usually direct when a city was taken. The prism is not friendly to Judah. That is exactly why its wording is so interesting. If the only surviving source were written by Jerusalem, we might suspect that humiliation had been hidden, but here, the unfriendly source is the one that gives us the limit. Sennacherib had every reason to magnify his own power. He magnified it loudly. He just did not describe Jerusalem the way he described places he took. The phrase about Hezekiah being shut up like a bird in a cage is one of the most memorable lines in ancient Near Eastern royal writing. It is vivid, humiliating, and carefully chosen. It tells the listener that the king of Judah was contained. His land was reduced. His options were narrowed. His capital became a cage rather than a throne. But a cage is not the same as a captured city. That is the tension at the center of the story. Assyria could present the campaign as a success without claiming the final dramatic image we might expect: Jerusalem breached, burned, and emptied. Maybe the tribute mattered more than occupation. Maybe logistics, disease, politics, or wider imperial concerns pushed the army away. Maybe Jerusalem's defenses and water planning helped the city endure long enough for the situation to change. The sources do not let us reduce the outcome to one clean cause. What they do allow is a sharper statement. Assyria wanted to show Hezekiah humbled, but it did not leave us the kind of conquest claim it left for Lachish. This is the difference between defeat and destruction. Hezekiah could be politically defeated, financially drained, and publicly shamed while the city remained uncaptured. Modern readers often want one label. Ancient outcomes were messier. A campaign could succeed without producing every result the attacker might have wanted. The biblical account tells the story differently. It moves close to the city wall, to speeches, fear, prayer, and a sudden reversal. Assyrian officials speak to Jerusalem in a language the people can understand. They mock trust in Egypt, mock confidence in the Lord, and present surrender as the only rational choice. This is not the same kind of source as an Assyrian royal inscription. It is theological history, shaped to explain the survival of Jerusalem through divine deliverance and the faithfulness of Hezekiah. Its purpose is not to give us an Assyrian campaign report, but the biblical account and the Assyrian account overlap in important ways. Both know that Sennacherib came. Both know Hezekiah was under extreme pressure. Both know Jerusalem was central to the crisis. Both leave us with a city that survived. The differences matter. The overlap matters too. The historian's job is not to flatten the sources into one voice, but to listen to what each is trying to say. That means we can take the biblical fear seriously without turning every line into a battlefield report. We can take the Assyrian boast seriously without accepting it as neutral fact. And we can let archaeology test both by asking what kind of city, landscape, and military world these texts assume. So why did Jerusalem survive? The honest answer is that no single explanation can be proven beyond dispute. Several possibilities probably belong in the picture. First, Jerusalem was difficult terrain. A hill city with prepared defenses is not the same as an exposed village. Second, water planning mattered. A city that can keep water inside its walls has more time. Third, tribute may have changed the calculation. If Hezekiah paid heavily, Assyria could claim submission without spending more lives on a costly assault. Fourth, imperial armies had calendars. They had other fronts: supply limits, disease risks, and political pressures. None of those explanations has to cancel the biblical claim. They are different kinds of explanation. One speaks in theology, the other speaks in strategy and logistics. What we should avoid is turning the story into a simple battlefield victory. Jerusalem survived, but it survived inside a devastated kingdom. Assyria left with tribute, prisoners, and prestige. Hezekiah remained in his capital. That messy outcome is what makes the episode believable. In a way, the mess is the point. If Jerusalem had simply crushed Assyria, Assyrian records would be hard to explain. If Assyria had simply taken Jerusalem, the biblical survival memory and the absence of a conquest claim would be hard to explain. The evidence fits a middle outcome: pressure, payment, damage, and survival. Survival can hide suffering. If we focus only on Jerusalem, we miss the cost paid by the rest of Judah. Assyrian campaigns were not abstract movements on a map. They entered fields, towns, roads, and families. A fortified city falling meant people were killed, displaced, taxed, or deported. The reliefs of Lachish force that human cost into view. Men and women leave the city. Soldiers process captives. Assyria turns civilian trauma into royal display. For the empire, these people prove the king's power. For Judah, they represent the price of rebellion and the limits of Jerusalem's protection. This is important for the tone of the episode. Jerusalem's survival is remarkable, but it is not a clean triumph. The capital remained, yet much of the kingdom around it was damaged. Hezekiah kept his throne, but not without humiliation. Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem, but he did not leave empty-handed. Ancient history is often most honest when it refuses to turn complicated outcomes into simple wins. Imagine walking through Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. The walls do not simply decorate the room, they teach you how to see the world. The king is order. Rebellion is chaos. Siege engines, soldiers, captives, tribute, and defeated cities all move toward the throne. In that visual world, Lachish was useful. It showed the empire doing what empires promised to do. It made Judah's punishment visible. It transformed a campaign in a distant land into a permanent royal performance. Jerusalem's absence from that kind of conquest display is not proof by itself, but it is meaningful in context. Assyria had artistic and textual habits. It had ways of celebrating victory. It had no modesty about conquered cities. If Jerusalem had fallen like Lachish, the silence would be strange. Instead, the surviving Assyrian voice gives us containment, tribute, and humiliation, not a breached Jerusalem. That is still an Assyrian success story. It is just not the success story we would expect if the city had been taken. The tunnel gives the episode its most physical scene. Long after armies moved away, people could still walk through the channel cut in the rock. The inscription found there describes the final moment of excavation. Voices heard through stone, picks breaking toward each other, water flowing from the spring to the pool. Whether we date every part of the system exactly to the siege moment or to a broader defensive program, the tunnel belongs to Jerusalem's survival imagination. It turns the story from palace inscriptions and wall speeches into labor, dust, lamps, tools, sweat, and the sound of water in darkness. That matters because ancient cities survived through infrastructure as much as courage. Walls without water become traps. Faith without planning leaves people thirsty. Hezekiah's remembered preparations placed the city's survival inside a practical world. The tunnel is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is a reminder that the fate of a city can depend on where water flows when the gates are shut. This is why the title has to be careful. It would be too simple to say that Jerusalem defeated Assyria. The Assyrian army was not wiped from history. Sennacherib remained king. Assyria continued to be terrifying. Judah paid. Lachish fell. The countryside suffered. It would also be too simple to say the biblical survival story has no historical weight. Assyrian sources themselves do not claim the capture of Jerusalem. They describe pressure, confinement, tribute, and submission. That is not the same as the fall of the city. The stronger version is more precise. Jerusalem survived the empire that destroyed its neighbors. That sentence allows the destruction around Jerusalem to remain visible. It allows Assyria's power to remain real. It allows Hezekiah's humiliation to remain part of the story, and it still preserves the central surprise. Good ancient history often lives in that tension. The best stories are not the ones that remove complexity. They are the ones that make the complexity understandable. Jerusalem's survival shaped memory far beyond the 8th century BC. For Judah, the city became a sign that catastrophe could come close without having the final word. For later readers, the siege became a story about arrogance, faith, fear, and deliverance. For historians, it became a rare case where imperial inscription, biblical narrative, monumental art, and archaeology all press against one another. The survival did not make Jerusalem invincible. More than a century later, Babylon would do what Assyria did not. The city would fall, the temple would be destroyed, and exile would become another defining memory. That later disaster makes the Assyrian episode even sharper. Jerusalem was not protected from history forever. It survived one particular crisis, against one particular empire, under one particular set of conditions. That is enough. We do not need to turn the city into a myth outside time. The real story is already powerful. Assyria came west, Judah broke around Jerusalem, and the capital remained standing. At the end, the most important evidence may be the shape of the story Assyria did not tell. It told us about towns taken from Hezekiah. It told us about tribute. It told us about confinement. It showed us Lachish in stone. It knew how to celebrate conquest when conquest was the message. But Jerusalem did not become Lachish. No surviving Assyrian palace wall gives us Sennacherib watching Jerusalem fall. No royal line says the city was stormed and emptied. Instead, the empire's own language stops at the cage. That is why this episode matters. It is not a simple confirmation of one source by another. It is a collision of voices. Assyrian royal confidence, biblical survival memory, carved conquest art, tunnel engineering, and a city that remained on the map. Jerusalem survived the empire that destroyed its neighbors, not untouched, not triumphant in every sense, but standing. And sometimes in the ancient world, standing was the part no empire wanted to explain.